cable or satellite provider. With 18 days until the election, C-SPAN is your primary source for campaign 2018. Next, a debate from Minnesota's 1st Congressional District between Republican Jim Hagedorn and Democrat Dan Feehan. They're vying for the seat of Democratic Representative Tim Walz, who's running for Minnesota governor. This is 45 Minutes.
This is NPR News. I'm Mike Mulcahy. Minnesota has 8 seats in the U.S. House, and at least 4 of them are competitive this year. One of those seats is in the 1st District in southern Minnesota. The seat is open because DFLer Tim Walz is running for governor. The district just north of the Iowa border includes several good-sized cities, including Rochester, Mankato, Winona, Owatonna, New Ulm, and Worthington. Let's meet the candidates. On the Republican side, Jim Hagedorn came about 2,600 votes short of winning 2 years ago. This is the 4th time he's tried for the 1st District seat. He previously worked for the Treasury Department in Washington. And on the DFL side, the candidate is Dan Feehan. He's an Army veteran who did 2 combat tours in Iraq. After that, he taught middle school and worked in the Defense Department during the Obama administration. Thanks very much, both of you, for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
We won't have a lot of rules this hour, no stopwatches, but I want to give each of you a fair chance to state your views. I'll ask questions. I asked the listeners to send me some questions. I got quite a few, so I'll get to as many of those as possible, too. Jim Hagedorn, let me start with you. You've been a strong supporter of President Trump. He was in Rochester holding a rally for you this past week. What role should Congress play in regard to the White House? Back the president 100% or a check on power on the executive branch?
Well, I've been campaigning and for my whole life believed in certain conservative positions and fundamental positions as far as defending the Constitution and other things. And it just so happens that the campaign I ran in 2016 matched up on the issues with Donald Trump. And so I'm very, very pleased that he's our president and that we're moving the country in the right direction. I've said for a long time that the United States Congress, the legislative branch, needs to reassert its authority in many areas. During the Obama years, I wasn't happy with the way that the Obama administration had expanded regulations contrary to the intent of the Congress, and I thought that they needed to pull that back. I support something, for instance, called the REINS Act that would require the House and the Senate to affirm major regulations moving forward. So, yes, independent branches of government, checks and balances. EPA is another area where I didn't agree with President Obama. So that's important. But on the other hand, this election is about 2 fundamental choices, 2 worldviews. Which direction are we going to go? Are we going to go the direction of the resistance, the people that want to replace President Trump, the people that want to take us back to the Obama years and then some? That's where my opponent, Dan Feehan, is on. And I'm on the other side. I want to partner or keep working with like-minded people in Washington to move the country in the right direction, to keep us safe, to make us prosperous, to protect our God-given rights, and to sustain agriculture and our rural way of life. And I hope we'll talk about a lot of those issues today.
Mm-hmm. And let's let Dan Feehan speak for himself. What do you see as the role of Congress as it pertains to the White House?
Mike, it's a great way of starting it, speaking for oneself. And that's something I'm committed to doing here. First, I wouldn't be remiss. Thank you for putting this together. Thanks for having this forum happen. I think it's a great chance to see a contrast of approaches, contrast of substance, and this couldn't be a more fundamental one. I am running to be an independent voice in Washington, D.C., because per our Constitution, that's what the U.S. House of Representatives was designed to be. And it is one of the many ways in which Congress in Washington is dysfunctional right now, because it is hyper-partisan, because people are unwilling to work across the aisle, and people are unwilling to be a check and balance against the president. I've been pretty clear on where I stand on this. Because I'm an independent voice that's not beholden to any party leader or any corporate special interests, I'm willing to work with the president when it benefits Southern Minnesota. But you better believe I'm willing to stand up to him when it doesn't. And as I watched my opponent stand on stage with the president, as the president told us that everything in agriculture was going great in the middle of an escalating trade war that impacts us directly, I think there's no more telling an example of an unwillingness to stand up to the president, an unwillingness to make Congress that check and balance that it must be per our Constitution.
Jim Hagedorn, let's talk about those tariffs as long as Mr. Feehan brought
Sure. I mean, we're happy to get into that. But, Dan, you're not an independent voice. You're a political appointee of Barack Obama. You were sent out here by the resistance, Pelosi and company, to try to take power in this district and take it back and have a very left-wing viewpoint. And as far as working with the president, I mean, did you support him on the tax cuts? No. Did you support him on, what do you support him on? I don't think there's much that you did. Almost every Democrat voted against. I think every Democrat voted against the Farm Bill because they don't like work for welfare. Did you support him on that? So, I think when you look at it, you're not an independent voice. You're a very leftist voice, and you're going to go back there and you're going to work with Pelosi, and you're going to work against the president every step of the way. As far as the tariffs,
wait. Okay. I have to let Dan Feehan respond to that.
Absolutely. So this is the tone of Mr. Hagedorn's campaign. This is his fourth run at the seat, and this is what he brings to the table. This idea of an us and them, and that's not what I'm about here at the end of the day. You want to talk about what independent leadership is? It's the ability to look at a burning Pentagon on 9/11 and decide it's time to suit up, that it's time to serve this country. You want to take a look at what independent leadership is. It's the ability to jump into a middle school classroom to make sure that kids were able to learn. You want to talk about what independent leadership is. It's the idea that I said to myself, it is time to serve the country again. No one told me to do anything at any point or step in my life. That's what independent leadership is. That's what it looks like. You want to talk about what critical thinking is as it applies to any number of these policies. I'm happy to demonstrate that.
I respect and honor.
Let me just get a question in. Dan Feehan, do you agree with President Trump on any issue? And
yeah, absolutely.
So
and this is something that I've watched my opponent turn as the president turned. The president campaigned on ending the war in Afghanistan during his campaign. That's something I absolutely agree that we must start making work towards. It turned 17 years old this year. We've been at war for 17 years to the tune, if we ended the war on terror today, $5 trillion. The president was certainly of that mind, and that's something I was hoping to be able to partner with him on. But he changed his views on that. And you know who changed their views on that along with him? My opponent, Mr. Hagedorn.
Jim Hagedorn.
Hang on a second. I wrote a column in 2014 when I ran against Tim Walz for the first time saying the war in Afghanistan had gone on long enough, that we should end the war. When am I quoted since then? When am I quoted as saying anything different since then? I know you weren't living here. You're working for Obama in D.C. You're not from the district. You never lived in our district a day in your life until Tim Walz quit this race and they sent you out from Washington. That's fine. Maybe if you were here, you would have read that column, but that was my position. So should we talk about the differences in the issues?
One more thing.
Yeah.
Is there anywhere, Jim Hagedorn, where you disagree with President Trump?
Sure. I've said long ago I didn't like the omnibus spending bill that he signed, and I said I would never vote for another one because it doesn't allow us to reform government. It doesn't allow us to have regular order and appropriations. And I said I would never vote for it because we're just kicking the can down the road and making our debt even larger. I'm not a fan of tariffs. I don't believe in them. I think that tariffs generally are good for the governments that impose them and the industries that they try to protect, but that's a short, diminishing returns. But as far as what the president's doing on tariffs and trade, he ran on this issue. He said China was cleaning our clock. China was manipulating our currency. They were stealing our intellectual property. They were doing all sorts of things, and he wanted to reset things with China, Mexico, and Canada. We were already reset with Mexico and Canada. That's good. Does Dan support that? I do. I support what the president did there. It helped us with dairy tariffs. It helped us with lots of things in agriculture and across the board. But in the end, the president's goal, and it's my goal, and I would serve on this in Congress, get rid of these barriers, open up global markets, make sure that we have markets for the best agricultural products in all the world. I supported the TPP, which was negotiated by President Obama, his old boss. That was a bipartisan thing. I don't know if Dan supports that. He never will answer the question. But we have to do what we have to do for southern Minnesota in our interest, and I would represent our interests every day on the job.
Dan Feehan on tariffs and trade and the TPP for that matter.
Sure, but more broadly to what this election is about, this idea of checks and balances and the unwillingness of my opponent to differ from the president. His willingness to be a rubber stamp, so to speak. I sat next to him at Farm Fest back in August as he told farmers of our district to simply just be patient, to be patient with their paychecks because he wanted to support the president's policy on this, a policy that was executed without any role of Congress being a part of it, without any check and balance to how that would hurt and impact our economy. And he did that because his entire career has been based in Washington, D.C. He is an insider to what these things are about and what he would bring there. I don't understand why he doesn't just become there's some openings in the Trump administration. I think there'd be a great opportunity for you to continue your work there.
Well, before I was in Washington, I was I grew up on a farm in southern Minnesota. Truman.
As did I, Jim, which is dishonest for you to hide.
One at a time.
Dan, you didn't grow up in this district. There are 21 counties in this district. Where did you live before you came here to run for Congress?
I grew up in the first district of Minnesota, which included Red Wing, Minnesota, Jim, which including then Tim Penny at the time.
Let me. You're being disingenuous and phony because the first district changed 20 years ago. The 21 counties of this district you never lived in. Let's just get that out. I grew up on a farm near Truman. My father, grandfather, great-grandfather were all southern Minnesota farmers. If I were to be on the Ag Committee, and that's something that I really want to do to help southern Minnesotans farmers in our rural communities, believe it or not, I'd be the closest thing to a farmer on the Ag Committee because they don't have any farmers anymore on the Ag Committee. Also, there are no Republicans from Minnesota on the Agriculture Committee in the House and the Senate. We need bipartisan leadership there. And I would work with all the folks from different parts of the country, different parties, to make sure that all of agriculture was successful. That's been my background. And I also worked for a Minnesota congressman who was on the Ag Committee, Arlen Stanglin, 7 years. You discount that service. We did good things out in Washington, and I reformed government. And I'm not going to take issue with you demeaning my service. I don't demean yours. Don't demean mine.
No, I get confused on how you seem to forget the 30 years you spent in Washington, D.C., because I fail to make the connection as to how that experience helps you to represent southern Minnesota. I can look at my own record of service on how leading soldiers in wartime, how teaching students helps you to be a policymaker, because what is happening in Washington, D.C. is inaction. Inaction that's a byproduct of hyperpartisanship, of which my opponent represents to the nth degree. Well, I am trying to represent all of southern Minnesota at the end of the day. Whether or not anyone votes for me, I'm trying to represent everyone that's there, because time spent as a soldier, as a teacher, working in the Pentagon taught me that you're going to have to agree with people. You're going to have to work with people, rather, that you don't agree with. That's what the hard work is.
Well, can I answer that?
Yes.
Here's how my experience in Washington converts to this job. I worked for a Minnesota congressman for 7 years. We carried many bills in a bipartisan fashion. The Work for Welfare bill that I still believe we need to reinstate. We did with Congressman Stenholm, for instance, of Texas, a Democrat. We also worked with the NRA to make sure that we got rid of the 1968 Gun Control Act, which was restricting firearms rights to the American people. We worked on a number of issues for rural enterprise zones to push that idea when people like Jack Kemp were doing it for urban areas. So I understand how the Congress works out there. I've been in the middle of it. I also was a Treasury Congressional Relations Officer. And you know what I did with my job? Downsized my own federal agency. It's unheard of. We put a bill together called EFT 99. It closed 4 check writing centers of my agency, eliminated 5% of our agency's workforce, saved $2 billion, improved the service to the American people. That's what I did with the job. I've moved bills through the Congress. I've worked in the Congress. I have the experience to know where the bodies are buried and go out there and unearth them and reform government and downsize government.
Dan Feehan, any response?
Yeah, Washington is full of Jim Hagedorns. That's why it is broken right now. People who are beholden to their party leaders, people who are beholden to corporate PACs and special interests, which is why I've not taken a dime from corporate PACs, because I know that what prevents both parties from moving anything forward, I hope we get a chance to talk about healthcare and things like that, is the ability of people to have an unwillingness, as they do right now. That's why it is broken, and that's what people hate. That's why people are cynical about politics today.
We will certainly get a chance to talk about any number of issues if you guys want to.
That'd be great.
Let me just stay on the area of agriculture for 1 second, though, because I did get a question from a listener who said, what would you do, or what could the federal government do to address continued poor water quality in almost all southern Minnesota lakes and streams? Dan Feehan, do you want to start with that one?
Yes, absolutely. We have to take advantage that farmers are stewards of their own land, first and foremost. And the idea that I think you have to make policy through carrots and not sticks. And it's incumbent on the rest of the community that's not in farming to do their part to clean up water too. But you have to have investment too, and that's where the idea of infrastructure comes in, because infrastructure is not just roads and bridges, but it's an investment in water. And no one knows that more than the southwest corner of the state and the community of Worthington, that desperately needs, it's not just a matter of quality of water, but having water in the first place. There's a role here for the farmers to play, that because they've been a part of doing incredible work to clean up water along the way, that shouldn't just be based on carrots alone. That's something I want to make sure and stand up, because the idea of regulations, as becomes part of this, that I imagine my opponent will talk about here, has to be one in which farmers are a part of the conversation, leading the conversation, because they, at the end of the day, have as much interest, if not more, in the quality of land, soil, and water to be there.
Jim Hagedorn on clean water.
Well, I was just talking with Kevin Papp, the head of the Minnesota Farm Bureau, about these very issues 2 days ago. The Farm Bureau endorsed me because they want somebody that's going to be pro-ag, and this has to be a balance. What's been going on over the last many years against farmers has been an overreach. During the Obama administration, we had a war against agriculture. And part of that was led by the EPA under Obama that put out this Waters of the United States, which was a complete overreach. We had people in Minnesota with their buffer strips and everything else, and it's gone too far. They don't give the farmers credit for being good stewards of the land. The farmers don't want to waste their fertilizer and things like that. They don't want to do that. It costs them money. And so they are good stewards of the land. And I think we need to work together. But what needs to happen for somebody who wants to represent southern Minnesota, a very ag-based district, keep the input cost of farming down. Get rid of these onerous regulations in Washington. Let's have the RAINS Act, which means the House and the Senate have to affirm major regulations before they impact farmers and others. Does Dan support that? I don't know. He never will address it.
And then how does that clean up the water, though?
We should sunset. Well, again, it's a balance. It's a balance. I don't take the premise that every lake and stream in southern Minnesota is polluted to a point of no return. I think many of them are clean. It depends on the standards that
it's something you could probably demonstrate, though, through science, I imagine, right?
It depends on the standards. You can change standards all the time and say, well, they need to be this
about magic standard. You said it's impossible to determine whether or not they're of high quality.
I said it was possible. I didn't say it was. I think we're doing just fine.
All right, let me just remind everybody we're listening to a debate between the two candidates for Congress in Minnesota's 1st District. The Democrat is Dan Feehan. The Republican is Jim Hagedorn. The question of health care came up, and I got a question from a listener. What will you do to resolve the health care cost crisis? In other words, what would you do in Congress to make health insurance more affordable and available? Jim Hagedorn.
Well, the first thing we have to do is repeal Obamacare and replace it with free market reforms. At a minimum, send the authority back to the states. The state of Minnesota did not need Obamacare. This was the one state of all in the union that didn't need Obamacare. We had 94% of the people covered with a system in place for people with pre-existing expensive medical needs. And now, of course, the people that said, keep your doctor, keep your plan, save $2,500, Obama administration people like Dan, now they say, let's go to socialized medicine. Let's have universal health care like they have all around the world, and that's going to be the answer. It's not. That's going to make it worse, and I hope we can talk about that a little bit later. What I support is this, getting back to having insurance, act like insurance. Let people, and this would be the biggest tax cut most people get, let people spend money for insurance, medical care, prescription drugs, pre-tax. Nobody pays federal tax on that money anymore. That's what you should have in individual tax reform moving forward. Then have accounts out there so they can invest that money, save it. They have incentives for healthy living because if you don't spend it, you get to keep your own money. Have transparency in cost, very important across the board so people can shop. Major medical catastrophic coverage with a deductible that would be reasonable. That can be done by the insurance companies or private sector. And after that, a pool for people, high-risk pool for people with pre-existing expensive medical needs, paid for by the insurance companies, backed up by the government. Everybody gets quality, timely care. Everybody's in a good spot. Nobody goes broke over it. That's how insurance should operate.
Can I just ask you a question,
yes,
though?
Sir.
Because Obamacare said kids could stay on their parents' insurance till they were 26. Sure. And it also said that insurance companies couldn't discriminate against people with pre-existing medical conditions.
Yeah, we weren't doing that in Minnesota. If you want to add 26, that's fine. But the states can handle it. I trust that the state of Minnesota, with a good governor and legislature, are going to get it right, much more so than HHS bureaucrats deciding the standards of care for our doctors, taking away our doctor-patient relationships. Look, Obamacare was an absolute disaster for southern Minnesotans. We have people paying $20,000 and $30,000 a year for premiums with deductibles so high the underlying insurance is virtually worthless.
Okay, let's let Dan Feehan talk about this. How would you make healthcare?
No, it's an important point of approach, too. My opponent likes to bring up conversations from 2010 because he's been running for Congress since 2010. And that's an important point. I'm living in 2018 right now in the reality of a healthcare system that is failing people in every way, shape, or form. The status quo is not working. But what you heard from my opponent here is offering a chance to go backwards. I don't think that is an option right now that we can even consider with any seriousness. We have to go forwards. I believe in the market in the principle of free markets here. But the idea that someone on their private insurance right now, let's talk about that individual market. I talked to a farmer at FarmFest whose 2 kids had the flu. went to get them treated and paid $750 out of pocket for that. Her reaction to that was that she simply wouldn't go to the doctor next time because it wasn't worth it.
So what are you going to do about that?
In a country where flu deaths are on the rise. So what I would propose to do and start simply is the idea of a public option that people can buy into, a public option into Medicare, so that people are paying for it and it becomes an alternative. Because everything that my opponent just described here of the private system right now, it is a for-profit system in which people are attempting to make money off of people's health. There has to be another option there that makes an incentive for companies to drive their prices downwards and not continue to make a buck off of people. And the only way that Congress is going to be able to delve a way forward on this is to not have people under the influence of big pharma and insurance companies, something of which my opponent is under the influence of himself and something I am not.
Well, Jim Hagedorn, what's wrong with letting people buy into Medicare?
Oh, well, it'll destroy the system for Medicare, for one thing. And it's going because the system's about bankrupt now. So you're going to add to it.
If people are paying into it?
Hang on. Okay, take it to whoever you want, but that's my contention. The concept of Medicare for all, socialized medicine, universal health care, single payer, whatever you want to call it, is going to destroy medicine as we know it.
Those are all different concepts.
It's going to destroy medicine as you know it. It's going to make sure that we have inferior medical quality. Medical innovation will suffer. If you want more people on Medicare, guess what? The Mayo Clinic and all the fine institutions of medicine are going to be reimbursed at 50 cents on the dollar rather than $1 on the dollar. They can't sustain the model. If you do this, it's going to destroy the progress and growth in Rochester, Minnesota, and much of southern Minnesota. All those buildings going up, all the people that flow in to Rochester, that comes to an end. And so this is a big choice for the people. Do you want to put people in charge that are going to take us to socialized medicine, or do you want people in charge that are going to keep us with a private sector? As far as incentives are concerned, this is America. This is the way we do business. We have people incentives. Companies go out there and produce good medical devices and so forth, and drugs and everything else. Doctors go to school for many years, and they want something to return. There's nothing wrong with that.
Okay, Dan Feehan, response.
Yeah, absolutely. Bringing in the Mayo Clinic is absolute right idea here, and they have to be at the table with it. This is an institution founded and has been a leader in the world on healthcare. So why not have them at the table? And we're talking about large-scale health reform so that we can shift this country to a place of preventative care rather than just treating sick people when they are at their wits' end, when they have avoided going to the doctor because they either don't have insurance or can't afford it in the first place.
But
the Mayo Clinic has to be a part of this.
If you expand Medicare, it does pay less than private insurers, right? So how does that help the Mayo Clinic?
It helps the Mayo Clinic if Mayo Clinic is involved in a part of it in the first place, to be able to find the right incentives to keep them a part of it so that people can seek care. I talk to doctors at the Mayo Clinic all the time who treat patients all the time who either don't have health care they can afford or who have no health care at all. That is the default right now. That is the system right now in which we all pay for those costs in the first place. If the Mayo Clinic is a part of a large-scale reform in which we can shift this country's costs towards preventative care, we save ourselves so much cost in the end so that these discussions about what the reimbursements actually are become a moot point.
I'm not dumping on the Mayo Clinic here because there are a lot of hospitals across the country, but they don't take new Medicare patients for a reason down there in Jacksonville and in Phoenix because the model won't be sustained. They can't make it work on 40 and 50 cents on the dollar. And that's what socialized medicine brings us. Also, there are a lot of people that fly in around the world to go to Rochester for medical care, the finest in the world. That comes to an end because in a single payer system, the government controls everything, all the outcomes, who goes in. And by the way, you want us to have a system like they have in Canada, Germany, Great Britain?
But Jim,
hang on. You know who's flying in today to Rochester? People from Canada, Germany, and Great Britain because they're on a waiting list. They can't get quality care. They're coming here. Where are we going to go when we destroy that?
But you know that the U.S. has the most expensive system in the world and not the best outcomes in the world.
We have the highest quality medical care in the world.
Not if you look at the studies. But let me ask you a question.
You're talking about health care rather than medical.
How does the private market lower that cost, which is what people are complaining about when they go to the doctor? The copays and the are all too expensive.
Medical care is expensive because we have innovation technology and we have the finest medical care. I don't know too many Americans that are traveling around the world for their medical care. I think they're pretty much getting it here. I do know a lot of people coming in from foreign countries to get medical care in the United States. So that's my contention on whether or not we have the finest quality. As far as driving down cost, you say I want to take you backward. Transparency in cost is backward. transparency, so you know what it costs to go to the doctor, get an MRI, things like that. That allows people to shop. That brings competition into it. That allows people to make choice. We don't have that right now. And what's the incentive for healthy living right now? The incentive is you don't have to pay any more money out, but you had to dump 20 or 30,000 and pray that you never have to use it. If you get to keep your own money at the bottom end, now you have an incentive for healthy living. You get to keep your own money. You get to live a better life. Those are the types of things that we can have with free market and basically make it more into what we would expect in the United States of America.
Dan Feehan, final word on this, and we'll move on.
Absolutely. I think what you were here describing when I say the idea of moving backwards is to a place where people aren't guaranteed basic things like the coverage of pre-existing conditions. Just allowing that to go to the private market and just hope that it happens takes us backward to a place where you're not being entirely honest about, where people weren't entirely covered, where people didn't have health care, where millions of people less didn't have health care in the first place.
In Minnesota?
Yes, in Minnesota.
In Minnesota.
Yes.
How many people didn't have health care in Minnesota before Obamacare?
Where people paid more for the costs that they have based on their conditions right now.
You think they're paying less now after Obamacare?
No.
Really? Seriously?
I'm saying because of the influence of a private company who wants to make money off of people's health care. You talk about the cost of everything, the cost of that. Why do we accept that as the basic underlying cost? Why do we accept that as the idea?
Look, if you think the things are better for Minnesotans after Obamacare, you really need to get around and talk to people.
1 second. I'm telling you the status quo isn't working, but we cannot afford to go backwards on this. Everyone I talk to every single day simply wants more affordable health care, simply wants the ability to go to the doctor and not have to be their own doctor and make the choice of not seeking care when they need to have care, because these costs are costs we're going to end up paying in the first place. And there are hundreds of millions of Americans on a private plan right now, many of whom think it's great. All I want is that the system make sure that is as affordable as it possibly can be. That's where we're failing right now, and that's where Washington, D.C., as a dysfunctional place, is failing to make any action on this.
And the people who are on private insurance are essentially paying for the people who are on government insurance. Government insurance is going to reimburse hospitals and doctors at 40 and 50 cents on the dollar. You expand that, you're going to degrade medicine, you're going to take money out of the system, and if you think that works, I'd say again, go to Canada, Germany, and Great Britain and ask the people how it's working for them.
Let me change the subject. A listener asked a question about the tax bill that passed last year. If you had been in Congress, would you have voted for it? Dan Feehan.
We absolutely needed tax reform, but the problem is we still need tax reform. Tax reform that provides middle-class tax cuts directly, not indirectly, and the idea that it provides middle-class tax cuts at a rate higher than it did to our top earners. We missed an incredible opportunity to do it right now, and the idea that millionaires and billionaires took an incredibly large share of those cost savings created a bigger problem where we increased our debt by upwards of $2 trillion. So that is unacceptable to me right now.
So you would have voted against the...
I have opposed it because it didn't take tax reform in the right way. It didn't make that direct impact, and it is dishonest to suggest that the working people got the best deal they possibly could have had.
Jim Hagedorn.
Yeah, so you would have voted against it like all the other Democrats. I mean, here's where we are. I would have voted for it. Yeah, of course. It was a step in the right direction for businesses, and I had said it at the time. This is mostly a corporate and business tax cut, and it was designed to try to bring money back from overseas. It was designed to get the economy stimulated in many ways. It was something that was very good for farmers. You should get down there and talk with the farmers about the tax reform bill. Very good. They can expense things in current years. So when they do get to making money...
During this trade war?
Yeah, okay, we can talk more about trade war if you want. But it was good for many, many, many people. There are lots of families in the district who are collecting $1,000 or more each year. And that's every year. So I support that. Should we have more tax reform, individual tax reform? I've also called for that. I just said one of my proposals is to make sure that anyone spending money, and it can be on education, it can be on health insurance, medical care, all those types of things, tax-free. Don't pay federal income tax. That would be one of the biggest tax cuts that people can get who are kind of in the middle getting squeezed, not at the bottom, not at the top. And then also after that, get rid of this code, the onerous code, make it so people can save, spend, hold, invest their own money the way they see fit, not the way the bureaucrats in Washington or the interest groups or the politicians would say. And that's the best way we give people power. We take it from Washington, we give it back to them as individuals. That's what I'm all about.
Let me ask a follow-up then from another listener who asked what he calls the biggest question to ask anybody going to Washington. How will you pay down the federal debt? Jim Hagedorn.
Well, obviously one congressperson isn't going to go out there and pay down the federal debt, but you can be part of a coalition of fiscally responsible people. I'm happy to do that if Democrats want to join us. But like I said, no more big omnibus bills, regular order on appropriations. We need to reform every single agency of government, starting with the Pentagon. We can grind out $50 billion in savings in the Pentagon, and people want to make sure we have the strongest military on earth like I do. We can take that money and reinvest it into the soldiers' pay and to the weapon systems if needed. But every agency of government, when I was out in Washington, I just took a little agency and found a niche and decided we could do some things different. And my boss gave me the go-ahead, and we went through President Clinton and up to the Hill. I worked with Steny Hoyer and others who Steny was out here for him. I worked in a bipartisan way, and we saved $2 billion. I'll give you one idea. If every member of Congress came up with something to save $500 million or $1 billion, we'd be better off. We'd get rid of this deficit. Why should the taxpayers of the United States pay for federal employees to go to and from work? Give them free transportation. Why do we do that? They're some of the most affluent people in the country as a group. They should have to pay their own way. They don't even pay tax on that benefit. Okay. And for go on subway and buses, that would save $500 million. I'm for that. Is Dan for that? I don't know.
Dan Feehan, what would you do to
I'm sorry, I'm still struggling with the idea. I thought my opponent just suggested cutting the military was part of that plan. Reforming the military.
What would you do?
That's what I heard as a takeaway here. That'll be an interesting one. See how that plays here. We just talked about one of the biggest issues, and the idea that the tax bill that has been passed has added to our debt by upwards of some estimates, CBO, $1.9 trillion. Added to it. So let's talk about the challenges of what we're doing right now. We need real tax reform that does the opposite here, where someone making over $1 million got an average cut of $69,000. That, to me, is unacceptable. But the other way that we can talk about cost here, I've already brought it up. We've been at war for 17 straight years. If we ended the war on terror today, again, and that includes every single cost along the way of actually being there in every country we've been in and the cost of veterans care along the way, that would be $5 trillion. The biggest thing we can do, and this is the burden of Congress to be able to take on, is to shoulder the burden of whether or not we need to be at war perpetually as we are today.
Let me ask you another question on a different subject that a listener brought up. The UN Council on Climate Change put out a report this week, said we have to take drastic action or it's going to get really bad. Drastic action soon. Do you agree with that report, and what would you do about it, Dan Feehan?
Yes, I agree with that report. And it shouldn't be a function of that first question. It's what do you do about it is the next one. We've had a couple of debates in the last week. We had one a couple nights ago in which my opponent declared that he wasn't sure about climate change, that it was just the earth warming and cooling as per usual. Well, I have a different perspective on this. I have a perspective of people like Secretary Jim Mattis and the perspective of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Dunford, who believe that long-term, the biggest threat facing our country in terms of security is climate change. And this question of what you do about it has to be then the next immediate question. And the next immediate question has to be answered with a perspective of southern Minnesota, too, where we've had an incredible amount of rain recently and more continuously. That is changing the way we are farming. That is changing the landscape of our district. That's taking the Hoka Falls and erasing them from the face of the earth. It's real and it's here. And so a function of what we do in the advent of our president not embracing the Paris Climate Accords and not embracing the threat that this poses to all of us is to make sure we're doing everything possible locally. And that's to make sure the 1st District of Minnesota is energy independent, that we aren't relying on fossil fuels, and we're making continual efforts to not do so. And it's making sure that people like in the U.S. Navy are trying to become energy independent and that you are championing those technologies because they will be to the benefit of all of us along the way. But if your opening premise, again, is the idea that I don't believe in it, well, then we have another thing coming, because I'd like you to give that as a response to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for example.
I'd say, whether you believe in it or not really doesn't matter. It's what you would do about it. If you think it's a problem and it's man-made, well, then what are you going to do about it? There are a lot of people out there, including on the left, who would say spend money to relocate, make changes, but to transform our energy sector and to turn our economy upside down over the premise that at some point the world comes to an end, no, I don't agree with that, because it would be highly destabilizing for our economy and it would drive up the cost for everybody in our country and make us less affluent. What I support is this. I support a policy of energy independence for the United States. And that means an all of the above approach. Now, Dan doesn't understand the issue, I don't believe, because the United States is energy independent for every source except crude oil. So the only way we're going to become energy independent is to drill for more crude oil in the United States, which I support. And I think the Trump administration has done a good job in this area. We also need to make sure that we have the infrastructure in place to utilize in an efficient way our energy resources. And we have more energy resources than any other country in the world. Pipelines, distribution points, refineries. Those are things that the Democrat Party aren't too fond of anymore, and that's why a lot of laborers are leaving their party. They don't even want to build pipelines. This Enbridge thing, they didn't like Keystone. President Obama blocked that. And then after that, just make sure we have a policy in place that we have abundant, reliable, affordable energy. Because when the price of energy goes up, the price of every product and service in our economy goes up. Money out of your back pocket makes us less competitive. All these things that Dan and Obama and others wanted to do, we're going to take power from the United States and send it around the world to our adversaries, our trading adversaries. Could be Brazil, China, India, and others. Point is this. He says he wants to do something about it. Do you support a carbon tax? Do you support the Paris Climate Accords? Do you support cap and trade? What do you support? Do you support the regulations on fracking?
Just to be clear, you don't support any of those.
No.
Things, Jim Hagedorn. Dan Feehan.
So his answer is to do nothing. Jim, what if the chairman of the Joint Chiefs were here right now and told you about the risk posed? This is a very real thing. So let's base this in national security. There are U.S. military installations around the world at risk because of climate change. They're very placed right now. If he came forward and said we need to do something about climate change with these, what would your reaction be?
Well, if General Mattis said that, and he probably would say we have to adapt, we have to react, we have to do whatever we can. But I didn't hear General Mattis come out and say he's for the Paris Climate Accords, he's for a ban on fracking, he's for a carbon tax.
His role is to make sure that we are supporting and defending our service members. And so again, if military installations around the world, these are American troops, are at risk because of climate change.
So how do you get there?
Is this a matter of belief?
How do you get there, Dan Feehan? Do you put a tax on carbon? What do you do?
Look, we have to make sure that we are doing first and foremost an ability to make ourselves as a country energy independent. And that means going away from fossil fuel. And as long as we are engaging in anything with fossil fuels, we have to do it in the safest possible way. But if we aren't doing everything to make up for the inaction of not being involved in the Paris Climate Accords, then we are going to fall further and further behind. The best thing I can do as a member of Congress is to make sure that a climate reform bill makes its way forward, entertaining any idea possible to reduce our carbon footprint. And that's why I'm open to it. But you have to be open to actually changing things and taking advantage of the opportunity we have right now economically in southern Minnesota to take and champion renewable energy like solar and wind and our biofuels along the way.
One more.
Yes.
You walked through a parade last year in Albert Lea with a sign that said "Act on Climate Change." We'll put it up on our Facebook page later. And you come on these shows. We had 3 debates, and you still won't tell us what you want to do to act on climate change. You do support a carbon tax. You do support the Paris Climate Accords. You do support cap and trade.
I've said it twice already, and this is a matter of listening at this point, Jim.
You do support the regulations that Obama had on fracking and methane and all these things to stop us from getting our own resources. And that's why the Farm Bureau and the farmers and others support me, because they know, what's a farmer supposed to do to act on climate? They're supposed to stop farming today or stop farming tomorrow. 40% of the
their crops more resilient and to actually deal with the impact right now. Something that I remember you had a tough time answering at a Farm Fest, if I remember right. How do we actually make sure that in the advent of a southern Minnesota that's dealing with more rain than ever before, that's dealing with an inconsistent of temperatures, how do we make sure our crops are more resilient along the way? Again, this is a matter of action, Jim, not inaction. That is the difference between us.
Again, I think your positions now are clear, and they don't reflect the views and values of southern Minnesota. I do believe mine do. We'll let the voters decide.
Okay, let me ask you this question. Do we need a wall on the Mexican border?
Of course we need a wall. We need a wall. We need fencing. We need every kind of security border we can so that illegal folks, drugs, everybody else don't come into the United States unless they come here through a legal process. Absolutely. Dan's against the wall. We've got him on, he's commented on that. We get that. But, overall what we need to do, and this has been a problem for 30 and 40 years, we finally have a president that wants to deal with it. Let's secure America's borders once and for all. Now, a wall is just half the problem. The other half the problem is that we have 5 or so million people who have flown into the United States on temporary visas that never left. They're here unlawfully. They shouldn't be. Some of them from terrorist countries. Some of them, could be people just like on 9/11 who cause us problems. We need to secure our country in many different ways. We also need merit-based immigration. We're the most generous country in the world for bringing in immigrants, 1 million a year. That's wonderful. But we should be in a position to know who's coming. Are they going to assimilate? They have a pretty good chance that they can contribute to our economy. You know, are they going to become part of the fabric of America? Because if they're not, it's not good for us to have them here.
Okay. Dan Feehan.
Absolutely. The premise of the question is flawed to me. Do we need to keep our country safe? Yes, absolutely. And we need to make sure we're doing everything possible to do so. And there's no one better to represent Southern Minnesota in that interest than someone who spent 2 tours in Iraq serving this country, keeping this country safe, and who spent 3.5 years in the Pentagon trying to keep this country safe. And I'm insulted by the idea that my opponent thinks that I wouldn't be able to be a part of this conversation, because that's not what my service taught me, frankly, in the first place. And if we're thinking about how to keep this country safe, it doesn't start with the one way you do it. It starts with a broader conversation about very much the real threats facing our country, which increasingly don't have anything to do with the border, but increasingly deal with cybersecurity, bioterrorism, and the many different ways that you can enter this country. If our entire focus is spent on the idea of the wall, we are going to miss things that are a bigger threat to this country along the way. If you want to have that conversation, great. If you want to have a conversation about immigration reform, I'd be happy to do that, because that's what I hear consistently in the district. People in need of workers, people who want an economic case for immigration reform, a moral case, a national security case, because in Southern Minnesota, we need to take advantage of the human capital we have to keep our economy strong. Okay. And so I'm someone who is a proponent and a believer in a guest worker program, a vigorous one. I'm someone who believes in making DACA law. And I'm someone who believes in the hardworking people that are paying taxes in our district to have a pathway to citizenship so that we can stay strong. But these conversations both happen to be happening. It is not one for the other.
Jim Hagedorn, what about the immigration reform?
Well, hang on. You know, Dan, I respect your service. I honor your service. Everyone does. But, you know, this is about service in the U.S. House of Representatives. And it doesn't seem like whatever it is you learned in the military has translated into informed positions on this particular issue that reflect what the people of Southern Minnesota want. They want border security. They don't want this sanctuary politics that you and Walz and others are talking about. You know, you're on record saying that the federal government should do its job on immigration and that the states and the communities, they shouldn't have anything to do with it. You know, you make Minnesota a sanctuary state, like you're talking about, you're going to have illegal aliens from a 10-state region rolling in here, driving up crime, driving up chaos, driving up our costs. That's not good for the people. We need to protect them. That's one of the reasons law enforcement, the Fraternal Order of Police, endorse me, is because they know I'm on their side. I don't want to make their jobs more difficult. We want to make sure that we have our communities safe.
Jim Hagedorn, would you do anything on immigration reform?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. You know, the one thing I've said all along is that we have to have a verifiable work program so people can come to the United States, fill needed jobs. That needs to be done in a meaningful way in order to help farmers and others and so forth. They come here on a temporary basis. If they want to go to and from, that's fine. Maybe we set it up so they could build up credits towards citizenship. We should do that. I support the Goodlatte bill that was just voted on many months ago that had that and some of the things that Dan talks about. That was kind of a compromise in many ways, but it made sure that we were going to have border security so when we do deport somebody, they don't come back over. You know, Dan, when should ICE do its job?
Let's give Dan Feehan a last word.
Good question for you.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And this is an important point to highlight, because I think your experiences in life shape who you are, shape your character. And the idea here, again, my opponent suggested that the things I learned overseas weren't good for Southern Minnesota.
I said they didn't translate into this issue.
Because this is a consistent theme. I think I'm speaking right now, sir. This is a consistent theme for Mr. Hagedorn throughout his life. This is a person that while I was overseas serving our country, fighting for our freedom, he sat behind a desk blogging about military veterans, blogging about the idea that a triple amputee was a half soldier and that they should just roll away. This is the character and viewpoint he has towards the 40,000 veterans in our district. It is telling of how he would represent in Congress and how he would disregard the viewpoints of those veterans along the way. I'm someone who views this differently, who views, because I took an oath of office to serve, to support, defend this Constitution, regardless of party, regardless of anyone along the way. And that's the same exact oath you take as a member of Congress. My experience informs how I would represent, and his character speaks for himself.
Jim Hagedorn.
Well, that's a stretch. And the idea that because you were in the military, all of a sudden on this political issue where you take a very liberal position that you're qualified, that you're going to speak for the people. I don't think so. The people can get it. If they want sanctuary cities, open borders, amnesty, you're the candidate. If you want to defend the border, merit-based immigration, have things like a work program, the Goodlatte bill, I'm the candidate that people can choose.
I was going to give you a minute at the end for a closing statement. We're down to 30 seconds now. Dan Feehan, closing statement, 30 seconds.
Yes, absolutely. I hope our listeners saw a contrast today. Thank you for putting this together, but that contrast was clear. And it's not just a matter of substance, it's a matter of approach. Washington is a broken place. It is dysfunctional because of the hyperpartisanship represented by my opponent. It's full of Jim Hagedorns today. It makes no sense to send another one there. It needs an independent voice that is grown by the values and beliefs of Southern Minnesota, and that's who I am. Informed by my beliefs and service and the need for a voice in Washington to represent Southern Minnesotans, not corporate special interests.
That sounded pretty partisan to me. I just say I'm a product of the district, somebody who has been out here working for 5 years. I wear that like a badge of honor. Over 21 counties, meeting 250,000 or so people. I think I reflect the views and values of the people of Southern Minnesota. I humbly ask for their vote, and I look forward to the next few weeks of the campaign with you, Dan.
You as well, Jim.
Thank you very much, both candidates, Republican Jim Hagedorn, Democrat Dan Feehan. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions today. Election Day is coming up November 6th. Be sure to get out and vote. I hope this helped you make up your mind who you're going to vote for. That's our program for today. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
With the mid